Hello and welcome to this special edition of the broadcast that we are bringing to you in collaboration with Voice of America. My name is Mohammed Saleh. The move towards electric vehicles in the United States of America's automotive industry has brought increased attention to the sector's reliance on Chinese technology. As Voice of America's Kane Faribault reports, a planned Ford battery plant is now drawing congressional scrutiny over this issue. Take a look.
When Ford Motor Company's executive chair Bill Ford announced in February his company was planning a new battery plant in Michigan, he said the $3.5 billion investment would promote U.S. independence in batteries needed for electric vehicles, or EVs.
Right now, many automakers import most of their batteries from abroad. This is a slow, expensive process that makes us vulnerable to supply chain disruptions.
But while the plant will employ U.S. workers, the batteries made would include technology created by CATL, a Chinese company with ties to the country's communist government.
They'll help us get up to speed so that we can build these batteries ourselves. Batteries made here in Michigan and built for America.
The news did not sit well with some lawmakers in Congress, including Republican Senator Marco Rubio, who opposed President Joe Biden's 2022 Inflation Reduction Act, which included tax credits for domestic EV production.
$9 billion to help people buy tax credits, by the way, with a Chinese battery in it. Oh yeah, you can't make those batteries without China. So great for China.
This month, Rubio introduced legislation blocking tax credits for producing EV batteries using Chinese technology and called on the Biden administration to review Ford's partnership with CATL.
The White House has already called for a supply chain review that would cover, essentially next generation batteries.
Jonathan Ward is the author of 2 books outlining China's economic, military, and political goals. He says decades of outsourcing technology and manufacturing left the United States with little choice but to work with Chinese companies like CATL to advance domestic EV development.
Essentially 60% of the battery market is made up of Chinese corporations, and CATL, the battery maker in question here, is already 34% of global market share.
From 2019 to 2020, Indiana University Associate Professor Sarah Bowerly Dansman worked as a policy advisor and case analyst with the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, or CFIUS, at the U.S. State Department's Office of Investment Affairs, where she led the reviewing of foreign investment transactions for national security reasons. Senator Rubio wants the committee to review Ford and CATL's licensing agreement.
Rubio is really, focused on this idea of that we don't want to be dependent on Chinese technology. The U.S. government coming in and changing those structures is a big imposition on the private sector, and so there really does need to be a strong argument for why it needs to do so.
In a response to Rubio's proposed legislation, Ford Motor Company stated that its own subsidiary will build and operate the new battery plant in Michigan, and that no other entity will get U.S. tax dollars for the project. Ford's plans for the new Michigan facility come as the American auto manufacturer reported more than $2 billion in operating losses in EV-related business in 2022. Kane Faribault, VOA News.
All right, now to get us more updates in terms of what all of this, of course, means, we're being joined by Voice of America's correspondent Jessica Stone, who's joining us live from the White House in Washington, D.C. Now, Jessica, what are the chief funding sources for clean energy companies like those that make batteries? Was the Silicon Valley Bank, which collapsed earlier this month. Now, this week, the American banking regulators have testified at the Capitol Hill about what led to that collapse. What did you learn about this?
Well, we learned that they knew about problems and had identified risks at Silicon Valley Bank as early as November 2021. In fact, they had issued 6 citations to the bank, but they did not prescribe a fix. And as we now know, Silicon Valley Bank did not fix anything, and it did not address the underlying risks that ultimately brought down the bank. But lawmakers also want to know what could they do? Should they hold all the responsibility for regulators and say this is a regulatory issue? Or do regulators need more tools? Do they need more legislation or rules? Now, the regulators during this testimony, they blamed bank managers. There was often a heated exchange between lawmakers who say regulators fell down on the job, but regulators say that bank managers are at fault. Irrespective of that, a Silicon Valley Bank was not actually required to undergo the stress test that many other banks are, much larger banks are required. And add to that, the tests that were actually done did not involve interest rate hikes and the impact that they have on investments. So they would have missed any interest rate hike type risk at any sort of evaluation. Now, regulators are now doing a review that they will release publicly on May 1st, where we hope to learn more details about where regulators failed and also where the bank failed.
Absolutely,
Mohammed?
very interesting there. Now, President Joe Biden traveled this week to a North Carolina semiconductor factory. He touted the investments that his administration, of course, is making in the U.S. economy. Now, Jessica, what might that support mean for his possible presidential run in 2024?
Well, I think we saw a blueprint for the presumed presidential campaign of Joe Biden when we saw his budget be released in the last couple of weeks. We saw a hefty tax increase on the wealthy. We saw investments in manufacturing through industrial policy and protecting social welfare programs. And the president's trip this week and the other trips that are expected from other administration officials in the coming weeks will largely go to outline the economic agenda that has been taking place under his administration thus far. There's been nearly $500 billion dedicated to increasing manufacturing, particularly in semiconductors, also in electrical vehicle production and clean energy, and something called biomanufacturing. Administration officials from the First Lady to Vice President Harris are now expected to fan out over 20 states across this country in the coming weeks, presumably when Vice President Harris returns from Africa, in order to highlight those economic proposals. But as it stands now, we believe that we should hear more about a potential presidential bid by the sitting president sometime towards the end of April. Mohammed?
Absolutely, indeed. That, of course, would be an interesting story to track. Do continue to stay on with us, Jessica, because we want you to weigh in on another important story that we're tracking here on WION. So as Japan lifts its post-war military restraints, perhaps no other place is feeling the heat more than the remote island of Yonaguni. Located not far from Taiwan, this tiny Japanese island is now slowly being transformed into a military outpost. Many residents are in fact caught in a bit of a conflict between China and the self-governing autonomous island of Taiwan, which Beijing claims is a part of its territory. Now, Voice of America's Bill Gallo gets you this report.
Sunrise on one of Japan's most remote and beautiful islands. Here on Yonaguni Island, wild native horses roam free along rugged coastlines. This is so far from the rest of Japan, sometimes it feels untouched by humans. The few who are here enjoy a serenity hard to find in other parts of the country. But trouble is just over the horizon. This is the westernmost point in Japan. Taiwan is just over 100 kilometers away, so close it's visible on clear days. That has brought problems. During U.S.-China tensions last year, a Chinese missile that flew over Taiwan landed just 80 kilometers from Yonaguni. For fishermen who make their living in those waters, it was unsettling.
Missile launches can't always be 100% accurate. It's a human activity, so it's very frightening. Almost all the fishermen here are afraid.
Taiwan isn't the only danger. Yonaguni is also close to a group of islands claimed by both Japan and China. Kotaro Kabari often fishes for tuna near the disputed islands, which have seen more Chinese patrols.
Recently, they chase you, they follow you, they approach you. The Chinese Coast Guard, I think. It's outrageous.
A fisherman on the front lines of China-Japan tensions, a fight he didn't ask for.
If they hit me, there's no way I can win that contest. It's scary when a boat that big gets so close.
For Yonaguni, the tensions have brought big changes. In 2016, a military base was established here, mainly for surveillance. Soon, Japan will bring missiles, part of a broader military buildup in historically pacifist Japan. For now, Yonaguni doesn't feel militarized, but many locals worry it's only a matter of time.
Having more military equipment now doesn't make us feel more secure. Having military equipment causes war. We shouldn't be doing this here.
Fumiya Kano was born and raised in Yonaguni. Even if a war broke out, she says she wouldn't leave.
I'd die on this island if it came to that. It'd be terrible. I love this island. I want to live here forever. I'm angry at this policy that could ruin our lives.
But with a declining population, many residents welcome any economic help.
These benefits are what led us to invite the self-defense forces to the island. Of course there was opposition. There was also a referendum, but we're overcoming those obstacles.
Mixed feelings and no easy answers, as Yonaguni tries to stay at peace in a region full of conflict. Bill Gallo, VOA News, Yonaguni Island, Japan.
All right, some very interesting changes happening there. And to give us more perspective, Voice of America's Jessica Stone is still with us. Now, Jessica, Taiwan's President Tsai Ing-wen is traveling through the United States of America this week and next on the way to and from South and Central America. The obvious thing is tensions with China will escalate during this visit. So how is Washington going to handle its meetings with Tsai Ing-wen given the tensions with Beijing?
Yeah, President Tsai Ing-wen is in New York this week. She'll be in California next week, where she's expected to meet with House Speaker Kevin McCarthy. And in New York, earlier this week, she made remarks just thanking the United States for supporting Taiwan's security. But Beijing spokesperson, through a foreign ministry spokesperson, said, quote, that Beijing firmly opposes the leader of Taiwan region, quote, sneaking off to the U.S. for any reason. So observers will clearly be watching to see how Beijing calibrates for this visit, to see if it reacts in the same way that it did when Nancy Pelosi visited the island of Taiwan over the summer, where there were large-scale military drills around the island of Taiwan by the Chinese PLA for weeks. U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan has attempted to cool the tensions a little bit. Last Friday, he had a phone call with Wang Yi, the top Chinese diplomat, which was unpublicized until more recently, essentially continuing to try to keep the lanes of communication open. And we also know that the White House, because there has not been a visit by a major U.S. official to Beijing in some time now, they are trying to consider a visit of the economic officials to Beijing. That includes Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo and Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen. They're talking about bringing them there for economic discussions. And National Security Council spokesperson John Kirby says, look, this is something that happens all of the time, that the Taiwanese president is constantly, not constantly, but regularly and routinely transiting the United States to go other places, so that Beijing shouldn't, he says, react angrily. Of course, there has not been a phone call between the Chinese president and the U.S. president. U.S. President Joe Biden, last time we had tensions rise with that Chinese spy balloon, said, I will call Xi Jinping, the Chinese president, but as yet, we have no information about a scheduled call, Mohammed.
Absolutely, indeed. Now, Taiwan is clearly a part of an escalating arms race in the Pacific as a participant and also as a territory that is preparing for conflict. I understand that a top U.S. military officer called it as an underreported arms race in a testimony at the Capitol Hill. What more information do we have on this, Jessica?
Yeah, that was General Mark Milley. He is the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and he calls it an underreported arms race because there are so many other countries staffing up, increasing their military budgets. He pointed to Australia, which has increased its military budget by $200 billion, investing in nuclear-armed subs alongside the UK and the US. Of course, Japan is doubling its defense budget. The Philippines expanding US troops' access to their military bases. And you know, the U.S. is currently conducting the largest scale military drills with South Korea in some 5 years. And so against this backdrop, Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin says that the Pentagon budget request is actually increased, and it increased in part due to the Indo-Pacific activity aimed at countering China, and that more money will go to the Indo-Pacific Command. But the Indo-Pacific Command has already identified some gaps. They say there's $3.5 billion that they need to add to the administration's budget request. So that will come out in testimony going forward. They'll have to haggle over those details. But the idea continues to be that all of the additional U.S. military spending, of course, should be directed at assets in the Indo-Pacific. Back to you.
Absolutely indeed. Jessica Stone, thank you very much indeed for joining us from Washington, D.C. there and getting us all those details.